Okay, so it's kind of raining cats and dogs outside, and I'm hoping that it will set the scene for today's episode, or else it will be a really bad listening experience for you. So hopefully it'll just work out, because today's episode is something that I'm very conflicted about in today's media and entertainment. So the world of media and entertainment has this relentless hunger for captivating real-life stories that has caused the meteoric rise of this one genre, true crime. From these gripping podcasts and blockbuster movies to viral YouTube videos and TikToks, the past decade has seen this insatiable demand for tales of crime and intrigue. In today's episode, I want to talk about turning the spotlight inward and asking this critical question: what does it mean to consume and create true crime stories ethically? So, sensationalizing violence isn't a recent phenomenon. In 16th century England, crime pamphlets were popular, particularly among the upper class, who were disconnected from the struggles of the lower classes and the justice system. These pamphlets told dramatic stories and ballads filled with explicit depictions of violence and witness accounts, and they were often concluding with a sense of divine justice, where the good always triumphs over the evil and the criminals were punished. Despite their graphic content, these pamphlets sparked curiosity about the criminals themselves. Audiences weren't as interested in the brutality of the crimes or the punishments, but in understanding the criminals' motivations, social lives, and emotions. The lower class, who had no time or ability to think about the criminals' perspective due to their struggles, was not the primary audience here. It's pretty similar to the way we consume it right now. Meanwhile, like the upper class, often detached from the harsh realities of daily life, engaged in discussions about the reports, press, and witness accounts, posing as amateur detectives, while the masses lived in fear or grief. So nearly 5 centuries later, the motivations and the ethical dilemma of consuming true crime continues and is still very much in the gray zone. So I kind of first wanted to understand why we consume true crime. And this has like very similar motivations to the first podcast episode that I talked about, like why we love consuming disaster media. It has very similar elements to this. So the viewers enjoy the mystery element. Obviously, true crime allows the audience members the chance to feel invested in a real mystery and the comfort and safety of their homes. And many in this way enjoy watching a case getting solved while feeling that they participated in it. Another reason is that a study on the motivations and engagement of true crime podcast listeners found that most of the online audience for these podcasts were female, because women engage with the true crime genre as a way to educate and protect themselves. As frequent targets of crime, they can use real-life cases to recognize warning signs and understand how to avoid high-risk situations. The study also noted that women were more likely than men to listen to these podcasts for social interaction, escapism, and voyeuristic interest. For me, I actually am an avid listener of these podcasts. When I first moved to a foreign country for my master's degree, I had a lot of time to myself and I was commuting to school a lot. I was walking and I had this free time where I wanted to listen to true crime podcasts, and they were interesting and intriguing, and they were like easy to consume. I didn't have to think a lot on them. The podcasters were doing it all for me, and because I was doing this experience for the first time, being alone by myself in a foreign country for the first time, I felt like it gave me a lot of insight on different ways people can be compromised, different ways that really bad things can happen to you. So not only they were entertainment, but also they had some kind of educational purpose for me, because I felt very alone and at risk at certain times, but I would say it also triggered some responses in me that were not very healthy. For example, the city I lived in was not like a very big city. It was not very populated. It was a very like developed, industrialized city, but it was not very populated. So there wouldn't be too many people on the street at any given time. And whenever I was walking, like listening to something, and I would feel like the presence of someone, especially if it was like a man, I would like jump out of my skin for some reason. And I remember talking about this to my friends, like whenever I see someone on the street, whenever they're like passing by me, I like do a little jump. I'm kind of like momentarily shocked. Or like whenever there aren't too many people in the street and there is a guy coming across the street, I would like draw a little circle around them just so that we're not like passing by each other. So I used it as an educational vehicle, but also it took a toll on my mental health for a while there. So that was my experience. I just wanted to talk about it because I am one of those women, and for a period of time, it was one of the things that I consumed so heavily. But obviously that does not mean that I am not conflicted when I am consuming these type of true crime media. So it's good to try to understand why we are conflicted on this matter. First of all, true crime always capitalizes on someone else's trauma. The biggest ethical problem in true crime is the violation of consent and privacy for victims and their families. Media companies and influencers can legally publish content without seeking consent and thus giving the personal details of victims' lives to the public eye. Victims' personal details like their names, ages, and family backgrounds are often exposed for public viewing. This practice can be deeply overwhelming for those affected. Most of the time they try to actually change maybe the names and try to protect the privacy, especially if there is not consent from the victims to begin with. And people always have a way of finding the actual person related to the case. And this practice can be deeply overwhelming for those affected, as their most painful and intimate experiences are broadcast to the world without their approval, which adds a layer of trauma to an already devastating situation. Think of it as strangers probing, theorizing, forming opinions, or maybe fighting online over the biggest tragedy of your life. These already vulnerable individuals are thrust into the unforgiving world of online judgment, where strangers pass unsolicited opinions and critiques. Even with the best of intentions, harm can still be caused, especially when creating an entertainment product centered on the most tragic moment of someone's life. At the very least, without consent, it just serves as a constant reminder and becomes a source of pain. While some can argue that the sympathy from these stories might help the families heal, it's important to recognize that everyone reacts to sympathy differently. Even if it's meant well, unsolicited sympathy can cause stress and make people feel exposed. Alternatively, true crime content can result in harassment of those involved in the case. For instance, the prosecutor featured in the documentary series Making a Murderer reportedly received over 4,000 death threats due to his role in the case. Or spotlighting a community in true crime media can permanently associate a location with a particular crime, something that the residents often do not want or welcome. So the one big ethical concern is that it feels very exploitative and damaging to the people who are actually trying to move past the trauma, especially when it's against their consent. And even when it's against their consent, the real stories, those of pain, trauma, and suffering of the victims should be at the heart of the storytelling and not the criminals who caused that suffering. Another significant ethical concern is the glamorization of criminals to attract more viewers. People's natural attraction to tragedy and crime driven by an adrenaline rush and a deep curiosity about the dark side of human nature, often leads to an unhealthy fascination with the perpetrators. Like, they cast actors like Zac Efron as Ted Bundy. This only intensifies charisma, turning criminals into charismatic figures and romanticizing their actions. This focus on the perpetrators shifts the narrative away from what truly matters, the struggles and experiences of the victims. This is also achieved by distorting and sensationalizing people and events to make the story more entertaining, exploiting the victim's pain and trauma for the sake of a more dramatic narrative. Another problem that is particularly very disturbing to me is the commodification of tragedy, because tourism often involves visiting crime-related sites ranging from historical crime scenes to museums, appealing to those curious about criminal psychology or drawn by media portrayals. While some sites do aim to educate, critics argue that this can glorify criminals or trivialize victims' sufferings. Similarly, true crime memorabilia, including artifacts linked to infamous cases or merchandise inspired by crime stories, has a niche but an active market. However, these items risk commodifying tragedy, and they do dehumanize victims and raise questions about the balance between curiosity, education, and exploitation. For me, when I went to London, there are so many Jack the Ripper tours talking about this criminal and taking people from site to site where so many women were brutally murdered, and using this as a form of light entertainment when you visit London. For me, obviously, I haven't been to any of the tours or don't particularly have a grasp on how each and every single individual navigate that kind of horror storytelling, and they take place at night to add this extra bleak layer. I can't imagine how they would turn around that kind of brutality and murder into something educational and worthwhile. But the more the industry creates its own narratives from the deaths of real people, the more audiences become desensitized to violence, turning actual trauma into just another fictional story or just another fun night in London. Well, another problem I want to talk about is that it's also not very representative of real-life homicide cases. In true crime narratives, victims are often portrayed as high-status white individuals, mostly females, who were killed by people from similar backgrounds, including some female perpetrators. Unlike many typical homicides, these crimes often don't arise from heated arguments, but are instead premeditated acts driven by motives like financial gain or family revenge. The offenders in these stories are usually caught and convicted, with a notable number receiving the death penalty, which is less common in general population of homicide cases. For instance, Black people are more likely to be victims of homicide, yet the coverage of murdered African Americans is often insufficient. When minority victims do receive attention, they are frequently not portrayed with the same level of sympathy as white victims. True crime media often distorts the reality of violent crime by overrepresenting cases involving white victims and underrepresenting issues like domestic abuse. This imbalance creates a skewed portrayal of crime, which can exacerbate societal fears. I think it directly aims to escalate some of our societal panics and fears. In many cases, the media we turn to for understanding and coping with our anxieties about crime may in fact amplify them by misrepresenting the true nature of who is most likely to be a victim and who is more likely to be a perpetrator statistically. By focusing disproportionately on serial killings and violence committed by strangers, true crime media overlooks the far more common and insidious reality that most violence is perpetrated by people we know. I think I have listed way too many problems with true crime, and now I want to talk about how it can be more ethical Because maybe true crime is not the real problem. Maybe the issue lies in how people approach it and who gets to tell a story and whose voices are being left out. Maybe we should think more about what purpose a particular true crime media serves, or does it inform and share a victim's story as someone whose life was unjustly taken from them? Or does it just give the author and the streaming service more money? So I think ethical journalism in this domain requires a thoughtful and respectful approach. The portrayal of events should honor the victims' memories, presenting their stories with compassion and truthfulness. Maybe enforcing consent from the families of the victims could be a great first start, because I think it's just imperative that consent becomes a requirement to stop the unethical exploitation of personal tragedies for financial gain. Another step towards being more ethical would be the protection of privacy. While there is natural public interest in criminal cases, this should not come at the expense of violating the privacy of those involved. The protection of personal details should always be a priority. This, again, falls under ethical journalism. Another thing would be avoidance of speculation and writing sensational headlines, because all storytelling inherently alters reality to some extent, as it reflects the perspective from which it is narrated and the storyteller's unavoidable biases and intentions, whether deliberate or unconscious. But the general agreement is that reporters, particularly podcasters, should avoid sensationalizing stories and keep in mind that these cases involve real people who deserve respect and compassion rather than attention or fame. Turning crimes into spectacles to attract listeners or readers undermines the integrity of true crime research. It's crucial to avoid speculation, relying strictly on facts supported by credible evidence. Speculative reporting not only misleads the audience, but also inflicts unnecessary harm on those affected by the crime. If you want to stray away from actual facts, as they did with baby reindeer, I think you should take extra measures to make sure that you protect the real identity and make it impossible for people to have access to actual human beings. For this case, we must introduce legislation that requires consent, holds media producers accountable for romanticizing criminals, and limits the dramatization of real-life events. This will transform the genre into a tool for positive change, one that supports and empowers those who have gone through similar experiences, condemns the perpetrators, offers comfort and closure to the victims' families, and honors the victims in a meaningful way, and enforcing laws that ensure the genre is used in a way that has a positive and constructive impact. By adopting a social justice perspective in their discussions, podcasters and TV shows could influence social change and make a positive difference in actual cases. Another approach true crime media can adopt is advocating in the right direction, because these stories often provide valuable insight into the justice system, while also shedding light on societal issues such as corruption, inequality, and systemic failures. By bringing real cases to the forefront, they can expose larger social problems, sparking discussion and raising awareness. Actually, some true crime shows have had tangible impact on the criminal justice system by bringing attention to overlooked cases that might otherwise have remained in the shadows. These shows have sparked public interest, sometimes leading to renewed investigations or the overturning of wrongful convictions. However, their potential for meaningful change is limited if they continue to prioritize sensational violence over the pursuit of justice. To have a lasting impact on a justice system that is often negligent towards vulnerable communities, true crime media must shift focus. They need to help viewers recognize not only the injustices within the specific cases, but also the broader patterns of police violence and systemic inequities that persist in the society. Vocative language may involve supporting the victim, as well as promoting policy reform, human rights, or addressing other issues linked to the case. Also, audiences, through their complaints and criticisms, play a significant role in holding creators accountable. The growing backlash against problematic portrayals in true crime media is a hopeful sign, suggesting that viewers are pushing for more responsible storytelling, one that goes beyond spectacle and emphasizes the need for social change. However, a critical issue remains: the lack of genuine engagement with the complex social constructions of crime and criminality. The true crime podcasts and shows often present these issues in a simplistic or one-dimensional way, and they fail to delve into the broader societal factors that shape crime and the justice system. This oversight weakens the potential of true crime media to foster a deeper understanding of the systemic issues at play, and ultimately limits their power to drive meaningful reform or social consciousness. Without this critical reflection, true crime remains a form of entertainment rather than a tool for societal transformation. But I'm not really dismissing true crime as a meaningless genre, because that would overlook its value as an art form. Art can be therapeutic, offering a way to comfort and imagine acts of violence and immorality from the comfort and safety of our homes. It serves as a tool for processing collective fears and horrors, allowing us to reflect on our moral frameworks by examining the actions of those who defy them. I'm also conflicted about my relationship to true crime media, but as I said before, I don't feel the need to stop consuming it altogether, and I don't believe others should either. Despite these nuances, it's crucial to acknowledge the genre's shortcomings and advocate for better representation and more conscious true crime reporting and true crime entertainment. Because I believe when approached responsibly, true crime can serve a noble purpose. It can honor victims, it can assist the families in their pursuit of justice, and it can raise awareness about important societal issues. This was Who Ordered a Small Yappuccino after a very long time. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, please follow me on Instagram, on here, on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts. It was great to be back after 6 months. Thank you.